Welcome back to another discussion of politics and social movement module. Again, for this discussion, we have Dr. Mahis, Senior Lecturer of Sociology attached to University of Colombo. He has, as I explained, a lot of publications nationally and internationally, and he had done a lot of research in environmental movement in Sri Lanka and also basically environment in general. So this discussion we are planning to focus much, have a much emphasis on environmental movement in Sri Lanka in the context of Dr. Mahis has a lot of experience in this area. This discussion, I hope, really would be helpful for you all to understand other social movements in Sri Lanka. We will consider this as a model or format for you all to understand other social movements of the country, local and international movements. So, Dr. Mahis, today there's a lot of discussion about environmental movements in Sri Lanka. Environmental, a lot of issues are there. So, as a starting point, how can you define environmental movements?
Now, thank you very much for again taking me for a discussion. And I think when you clearly look at the concept of the environment, we know that it's a kind of liquid word, because environment is a cross-cutting topic. It could be studied or researched by many different people, maybe zoologists, botanists, engineers, agricultural scientists, and also social scientists.
That's right.
So social science is a new field, especially sociology and political science, and that is why we say environmental sociology, political ecology, because now we look at the environmental issues and environmental problems from a new way or new perspective. In that respect, we know that whatever the definition given to environment is not very much general when it comes to environmental sociology, because normally in ecology science, they explain environment as a kind of relationship between the living and non-living organisms. So, but here we are looking at in a different way, because you know about the argument about the Peter Burgess' social construction of the reality. So it says that whatever the concept that we use in natural science or social science, that can be redefined, or that can be reconstructed with the changing setup of the society or the politics. So in that respect, environment is a kind of socio-economic, maybe cultural condition. How people are dealing with that particular condition, it's more than the physical aspect of the nature. So sometimes it's a kind of perception, it's a belief, it's a ritual practices, anything related to the outer world or physical entity could be environment.
Yeah. So, Dr. Mahis, how can this be a movement? How do people collect again, around or central issue of environment?
Now, you see that now there's an interesting person, is a social geographer called Ulrich Beck.
Okay.
He says, in the past, it is the nature that determines the culture. But at present, it is the culture that determines the nature. Normally, if you look at the interaction between the culture and environment, it's very important, not only for sociology, even for anthropology, it's very interesting. Even in Sri Lanka, you see that most of our culture has been influenced or determined by our nature or ecological system. Now, the way we dress, whatever we eat, maybe our housing patterns, maybe other beliefs and regional deity practices, gods, rituals, all are well determined by nature. So in that respect, we know that the concept of environment or ecology is very much closer to our life.
Yeah.
So we can't separate the environment from the society, because now, for example, you go and see the fishermen's, their culture, how do they interact with the sea? Look at the farmers, how do they interact with the lake or river or the tank? So that is, therefore, culture, without culture, you can't think about the society. So therefore, culture and environment are just like a two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
So these are very much interrelated to each other. So, but today at the present society, sometimes we have a kind of difference. We have two type of environment. One is natural environment and built environment. So that is where we have the problem. But in the past, it's almost equal. So therefore, I do believe that whatever the social component of the environment is very much related. I think I can explain in later after the discussion.
We have experienced a lot of political movements, let's say movements like JVP movements, youth uprisings, and also LTT movement. They are kind of political movements widely known to the people. So how, what are the similarities and differences of these two types of movements, environmental movements and these kind of political movements?
Yeah, very interesting. I think even environmental movement have to be understood in the place of the social movements. Because the concept of environmental movement or discourse of environmental movements, they emerge very recently after like us 80s or late 90s. So then we know that we normally in sociology we use three type of theories: crowd theory, and normally we say old social movement theory, then new social movement theory, then postmodern social movement theories. If we nicely place the environmental movement into these theories, of course we would understand the environmental movement in a different way. Now, whatever the environmental movements that are emerging in West, in the developing countries, those are belong to the new social movements. Because you have to understand what is really mean by new social movement. New social movements are not anti-class or anti-government or it's like a leftist Marxist movement. They are like new social movements are basically rooted on like a feminist movement or Dalit movements like in India, and like an environmental movement. So therefore, whatever the movements that are not directly touching the politics or maybe class or maybe state related matters, they are referred as a new social movement. So environmental movements are mostly belong to the new social movement. But some of the movements that are that took place in Sri Lanka and India and developing countries, even then again we can't say those are new social movements. They are again coming to the another different categories. Now, for example, if I am another interesting person or lady to mention here is Dr. Vandana Shiva. She is a leading scholar who is talking about the environmental movements in India, especially the Narmada movement in India, Chipko movement in India, and also the Green Belt in Canada, in Nigeria. So these movements clearly explain about some of the livelihood issues of the people. So they are not ideological based. Most of the environmental movement in the West are ideological. Educated middle class people are getting involved with the environmental movement. But if you look at Sri Lanka and India, most of the time environmental movements are emerging at the grassroots level among uneducated farmers and fishermen. So they are not much concerned about the fact of the environment or the ecological system or the nature. They are concerned about their livelihood and their culture. So they are not directly fighting for the nature. They are fighting for to save their livelihood. But livelihood is indirectly related to the ecology. So that is why we say life supporting ecological system. Now, for example, when the Colombo Southern Highway was constructed, people protested against it. They protested, or maybe Kandalama, maybe Eppawala, maybe Norachole, Apakotmale, they fought against to protect their livelihood. They were not much concerned about the nature.
That's right.
But in a way, this is what I am referring as a livelihood environmentalism. That I can say livelihood environmentalism.
It's a very interesting point, Dr. Mahis. Of course, in the recent past, we experienced a lot of environment-related issues coming up. It is really led for heated debates in the political arena as well. So it went to some extent even to change the governments. We heard Ratupasala incident and also lot of protests are there against environmental damages done by various factories, and water pollution, garbage disposal. That has become part of everyday struggle of the people. So how do you explain this kind of collective actions of the people?
Now, the thing is again how far people are related with the ecological setup. Now, you have to understand the ecology. Now, we know that we know very well when we look at the environmental problems all over the world, some people call like environmental terrorism. Or some people use the word hydro jihad. If you look at the Kaveri incident in India, there's a confrontation between two states, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, and maybe confrontation between India and Bangladesh because of the water issue. Because water, environmentalists predict that in another 25 to 30 years of time, the world nation will fight for the water, not for the oil. Because the natural resources are dwindling day by day, getting, slow, they are losing. So then therefore, in Africa, there are a problem called environmental poverty, environmental collective actions, because environment is related with their livelihood. Most of the people make their livelihood by using the nature. The good example is, like even if you look at Sri Lankan caste, most of the castes are related to the ecological setup, like Durava, Karava, Salagama, Wahumpura, whatever it is. When the forest is destroyed, one caste group will disappear. When the highway is put up through the some plantations, there will be an end of the another caste. So in India, when the Narmada Dam was proposed, a lot of tribes and caste fought against the government, because even their social identity, cultural identities are very much related to the nature. So then environmental movements are unifying the discriminated people, even middle class, lower class, different ethnic groups and the income groups are reunited. That's happened even in Sri Lanka, even in Vatupassala, Norachole plantation. Even Sinhala Tamil Muslim people, they got together and they fought against the government. So in a way, environment is a common ground where all can get together and go for a new social movement. So therefore, environmental movements always empower the civil society.
Dr. Mahis, that is really an interesting point. Environmental movements are developing, and we see at some point they are connected with politics, broader politics. So how do you see, can you please briefly explain this connection?
Yeah, you see that if you look at the last Sri-Lam war in Sri Lanka, that emerged because of the Mavillaru. Mavillaru incident basically was related to water. If you look at the world politics, now the world political leaders are very much concerned about the natural resources. Maybe like whatever they find in forest, rainforest, maybe natural, in Sri Lanka you see about the fight, continuous battle for the fishing in the Fox Stream. In between Sri Lankan fishermen and Indian fishermen are fighting. Why? Because of to share the natural resources. Even if you come to now with regard to the central government of Sri Lanka and the northern province, that there is a kind of contradiction in terms of the Iranamadu tank. So all over the world, the politics, political agenda will be determined by the availability of natural resources. Because in future, you will have to use more and more nature for the future sustainable development. So in that respect, we know that even the political nature of the political parties, even the green parties are now getting promoted. That's an interesting point I want to mention here, the ecological democracy. Now people are fighting for their ecological democracy. Some others, they call it as environmental rights. Now people are going to courts and making, bringing cases. They are filing cases against government, factories, because they fight for the ecological democracy. Because even in Colombo, when all are polluting the air, one can get infected with the air pollution related disease. So then he or she should have the right of enjoying the real environment.
It's a very interesting point. Yeah, you ended talking about environmental democracy, right? So I guess this discussion really gave us enough chance to understand about nature of the environmental movement in Sri Lanka, as well as broader sense about environmental movement. This can be considered as a model for us to understand other social movements in Sri Lanka and also in the other countries. So once again, I thank you, Dr. Mahis, for participating in this discussion. We'll meet again in another discussion in this module. Thank you very much.